In the quiet hush of a world still healing from the echoes of global war, a new tension began to stir, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Tonight, let your mind drift gently into the folds of history, where the Cold War began not with thunder, but with a chill, a silent contest of ideologies and ambitions. As you settle in, breathe deeply, and allow the story to unfold around you like a soft blanket of stars. The Cold War was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no sweeping battlefields or clashing armies, but rather a persistent, simmering rivalry between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Emerging from the ashes of World War II, both nations stood tall, yet wary, each bearing its own vision for the future. The United States, championing democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union, advocating communism and centralized control, found themselves locked in a struggle for influence, power, and survival. The world watched as alliances formed and dissolved, as iron curtains descended, and as the globe itself seemed to split into two ideological hemispheres. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, this tension manifested in various ways, through espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars. The Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact were all early signs that this was no fleeting disagreement. It was a long, cold standoff. Yet beneath the surface of political maneuvering and military posturing, another race was beginning to take shape, one that would reach beyond borders, beyond Earth itself. The seeds of the space race were sown in the laboratories and think tanks of both nations, where scientists and engineers, many of whom had worked on wartime rocket programs, began to dream of something greater. The technology that had once been used to deliver destruction was now being repurposed to explore the cosmos. In the United States, the legacy of the German V-2 rocket program, brought over through Operation Paperclip, provided a foundation for early American rocketry. Wernher von Braun and his team began to envision rockets that could reach orbit, even the moon. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev, a brilliant and enigmatic engineer, was quietly leading his own team towards similar goals. Both sides understood that space was more than just a scientific frontier, it was a strategic one. Control of the skies meant control of surveillance, communication, and potentially, weapons delivery. The Cold War was about dominance, and space was the ultimate high ground. As the 1950s progressed, the competition intensified. The United States established the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, which would later become NASA, and began investing heavily in missile and satellite technology. The Soviet Union, under Korolev's guidance, was making rapid progress with its R-7 rocket, a powerful launch vehicle capable of reaching orbit. The world was on the cusp of a new era, one that would be defined not just by terrestrial politics, but by the vast, silent expanse above. And then, in 1957, the silence was broken. A small, silver sphere, no larger than a beach ball, was launched into orbit by the Soviet Union. It was called Sputnik. Its beeping signal, heard by radio operators around the globe, was more than just a technical achievement. It was a declaration. The space race had begun. The launch of Sputnik sent shockwaves through the United States and its allies. It was not just the fact that the Soviets had reached space first, but the implications of what that meant. If they could launch a satellite into orbit, could they also deliver a nuclear payload across continents? The psychological impact was profound. Overnight, space became a national priority. Schools began emphasizing science and mathematics, funding for research skyrocketed, and a sense of urgency permeated every level of government. The Cold War had entered a new phase, one that was as much about inspiration as it was about intimidation. Yet even in this tense atmosphere, there was wonder. For the first time, humanity had placed an object in orbit around Earth. The stars, once distant and untouchable, now seemed just a little closer. As you rest here in the quiet, let that thought linger. The Cold War may have been born of fear and rivalry, but it also sparked a journey that would carry us beyond our world, into the vast unknown. And this is only the beginning. Let the story deepen as the rivalry between nations reaches for the stars. The launch of Sputnik was more than a technological triumph. It was a spark that ignited a global transformation. In the United States, the reaction was swift and intense. The beeping signal from the Soviet satellite echoed not just through radio waves, but through the halls of government, classrooms, and living rooms across the nation. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that the Cold War was no longer confined to Earth. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, though calm in public, recognized the strategic implications. Behind closed doors, the administration scrambled to assess the Soviet capabilities. The Central Intelligence Agency, already deeply involved in monitoring Soviet military developments, expanded its focus to include space technology. The National Security Council convened urgent meetings, and the Department of Defense began re-evaluating its missile programs. The American public, meanwhile, experienced a mix of awe and anxiety. Newspapers ran headlines about the Soviet satellite, and television broadcasts speculated on what it meant for national security. Could Sputnik be the precursor to space-based weapons? Was the United States falling behind in a critical domain? These questions fueled a surge in scientific interest and educational reform. In response, the U.S. government established the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, later known as DARPA, to accelerate technological innovation. Funding for science and engineering programs increased dramatically, and the National Defense Education Act was passed to strengthen education in mathematics, science, and foreign languages. The goal was clear: to catch up, and then surpass, the Soviet Union in space. But while the United States was mobilizing, the Soviet Union was already preparing its next move. Sergei Korolev, the mastermind behind Sputnik, was not content with a single satellite. He envisioned a series of increasingly sophisticated missions that would demonstrate Soviet superiority. Just a month after Sputnik 1, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a living passenger, a dog named Laika. Though Laika would not survive the journey, her mission marked another first, the first living creature in orbit. The world watched in astonishment. The Soviets were not just ahead, they were accelerating. In the United States, this deepened the sense of urgency. The Eisenhower administration authorized the creation of a civilian space agency, one that would unify the country's scattered efforts and present a peaceful face to the world. Thus, in 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was born. NASA's mission was ambitious: to explore space, to advance scientific knowledge, and to ensure that the United States would not be left behind. The agency inherited personnel and facilities from NASA, but its scope was far broader. It would become the centerpiece of America's space ambitions. As NASA took shape, the military continued its own parallel efforts. The U.S. Air Force and Army pursued missile development, and reconnaissance satellites became a priority. The Cold War had entered a new dimension, one where intelligence gathering and strategic deterrence extended into orbit. Yet amid the tension, there was also inspiration. The idea of space exploration captured the imagination of millions. Science fiction, once a niche genre, gained mainstream popularity. Writers and filmmakers envisioned futures where humanity traveled to distant planets, encountered alien civilizations, and built cities among the stars. The space race, though born of rivalry, began to stir dreams of unity and discovery. In classrooms across America, children learned about rockets and planets. Telescopes became household items, and amateur astronomers tracked satellites as they passed overhead. The night sky, once a quiet canvas, now held movement and meaning. Sputnik had changed everything. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Korolev continued to push boundaries. His team developed more powerful rockets, capable of carrying heavier payloads and reaching greater distances. The R-7 launcher, which had placed Sputnik into orbit, became the backbone of Soviet space missions. Plans were underway for lunar probes, interplanetary missions, and eventually, human spaceflight. The competition was fierce, but it was also transformative. Both nations poured resources into research and development, leading to breakthroughs in materials science, computing, and telecommunications. The Cold War, though fraught with danger, was also a catalyst for innovation. As the 1950s drew to a close, the stage was set for even greater achievements. The space race was no longer a theoretical contest, it was a tangible, accelerating reality. And at its heart were the people, scientists, engineers, astronauts, and dreamers, all working toward a future that reached beyond the confines of Earth. Let your thoughts drift with them now, through the corridors of laboratories and the silence of orbit, where ambition and imagination intertwined. The Cold War had found a new frontier, and humanity was just beginning to explore its vast potential. In the quiet hours of the 4th of October, 1957, a signal pulsed through the night sky, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat from beyond. It came from a small, polished sphere orbiting Earth, Sputnik 1. The Soviet Union had done what no nation had before. They had launched a man-made satellite into space. The world changed in an instant. That simple beep, heard by radio operators and amateur enthusiasts alike, was more than a sound. It was a message. It said, "We are here. We are ahead." The launch of Sputnik was a masterstroke of engineering and strategy. Weighing just 83.6 kilograms and measuring 58 centimeters in diameter, the satellite was modest in size but monumental in impact. It orbited Earth every 96 minutes, its radio signals confirming its presence and stirring imaginations across the globe. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph of science and a powerful symbol of national pride. For the United States, it was a shock. The implications were immediate and profound. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, they could potentially launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. The R-7 rocket that carried Sputnik had demonstrated capabilities that extended beyond peaceful exploration. It was a wake-up call to the strategic vulnerability of the United States and its allies. The American media erupted. Headlines screamed of a red moon and a space Pearl Harbor. Politicians demanded answers. Citizens looked skyward with a mix of wonder and unease. The Cold War had entered a new phase, one where the battleground was not just ideological or terrestrial, but celestial. In Washington, the Eisenhower administration faced mounting pressure. The president, cautious and deliberate, sought to reassure the public while quietly accelerating the nation's space efforts. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies scrambled to understand the full scope of Soviet capabilities. The CIA, already monitoring Soviet missile development, expanded its focus to include space launches and orbital trajectories. The National Security Council convened emergency meetings, and the Department of Defense began re-evaluating its strategic posture. The launch of Sputnik also had a profound effect on American education and culture. Schools began emphasizing science and mathematics, and federal funding for education increased dramatically. The National Defense Education Act, passed in 1958, aimed to cultivate a new generation of scientists and engineers who could compete on the global stage. The space race was not just about rockets, it was about minds. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the success of Sputnik was celebrated with fervor. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer behind the launch, remained anonymous to the public, but within the corridors of power, he was hailed as a hero. His vision extended far beyond Sputnik. He saw a future of lunar missions, interplanetary probes, and human spaceflight. Just 1 month after Sputnik 1, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying Laika, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow. Laika became the first living creature to orbit Earth, a symbol of both scientific progress and ethical debate. Her mission, though tragic, demonstrated the feasibility of life support systems in space and paved the way for future manned missions. The United States, still reeling from the initial shock, responded with urgency. On the 6th of December, 1957, the US attempted to launch its own satellite, Vanguard TV-3. The rocket rose a few feet off the ground before collapsing in flames, a public failure broadcast live to millions. The contrast was stark. The Soviets had succeeded, the Americans had stumbled. Yet failure bred determination. The US redoubled its efforts, and on the 31st of January, 1958, successfully launched Explorer 1, its first satellite. Designed by a team led by Wernher von Braun, Explorer 1 carried scientific instruments that discovered the Van Allen radiation belts, a major breakthrough in space science. The space race was now fully underway. Each launch, each orbit, each signal from the void was a move in a grand game of strategy and prestige. The Cold War had found a new arena, and the stakes were higher than ever. But amid the rivalry, there was also a sense of shared wonder. For the first time in history, humanity had reached beyond its cradle. The stars, once distant and silent, now echoed with the voices of machines and the dreams of nations. Sputnik had opened the door, and the world would never be the same. The launch of Sputnik had jolted the United States into action, and the response was swift, strategic, and deeply transformative. In the months following the Soviet triumph, the American government, scientific community, and military establishment converged on a singular goal: to reclaim technological leadership and assert dominance in space. The creation of NASA in 1958 marked a turning point. This new civilian agency absorbed the functions of NASA and expanded its mission to include not just aeronautics but the exploration of space itself. NASA was designed to be the public face of America's space ambitions, a symbol of peaceful exploration and scientific progress. But behind the scenes, the military continued to play a critical role. The Department of Defense, through agencies like ARPA, pursued parallel efforts in missile development, reconnaissance satellites, and space-based defense systems. The Cold War had made it clear: space was not just a frontier of curiosity, it was a domain of strategic importance. The Eisenhower administration, while cautious about militarizing space, recognized the need for robust capabilities. The U.S. Air Force and Army accelerated their missile programs, and the Navy explored satellite communication technologies. Intelligence gathering became a top priority, with early efforts focused on developing satellites that could monitor Soviet activities from orbit. The launch of Explorer 1 had restored some confidence, but the race was far from over. The Soviets continued to push boundaries, launching additional satellites and preparing for human spaceflight. In response, the United States initiated Project Mercury, a program aimed at sending American astronauts into space. The Mercury program was ambitious and complex. It required the development of new spacecraft, launch vehicles, and training protocols. Engineers worked tirelessly to design capsules that could sustain human life in orbit, while test pilots underwent rigorous preparation for the unknown challenges of space travel. The selection of the Mercury 7 astronauts, Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton, captured the public's imagination. These men became national heroes, symbols of courage and determination in the face of Soviet competition. Their stories were broadcast across the country, inspiring a generation to look skyward. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was preparing its own historic leap. On the 12th of April, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space, orbiting Earth aboard Vostok 1. The achievement was monumental, and once again, the Soviets had seized the lead. Gagarin's flight was a triumph of engineering and propaganda, celebrated around the world and deeply felt in Washington. The United States, though stunned, responded with resolve. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy delivered a speech to Congress that would define the next decade of space exploration. He declared that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It was a bold promise, one that galvanized the nation and set the stage for the Apollo program. The Apollo missions represented the pinnacle of American space ambition. They required unprecedented coordination, innovation, and investment. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians worked together to develop the Saturn V rocket, the command and lunar modules, and the infrastructure needed to support deep space missions. The Cold War rivalry had evolved into a race toward the moon, and every milestone was a measure of national prestige. As the 1960s progressed, both superpowers continued to expand their space capabilities. The Soviets launched probes to Venus and Mars, while the Americans conducted Gemini missions to test rendezvous and docking procedures. Each success brought humanity closer to the moon, and each failure was a reminder of the risks involved. The space race was not just a contest of technology, it was a reflection of ideological struggle. Democracy versus communism, openness versus secrecy, innovation versus control. The achievements of each side was celebrated not just as scientific milestones, but as validations of their respective systems. Yet amid the competition, there were moments of convergence. Scientists from both nations shared data, collaborated on research, and dreamed of a future where space exploration could transcend politics. The Cold War had created the conditions for rapid advancement, but it also hinted at the possibility of unity beyond Earth. By the end of the decade, the United States had made remarkable progress. The Apollo program was nearing its goal, and the nation stood on the brink of a historic achievement. The space race had driven innovation, inspired millions, and reshaped global perception as of science and possibility. The launch of Sputnik had been the catalyst, but the journey was far from over. The Cold War continued to cast its shadow, yet within that shadow, humanity had found light, a path to the stars, paved by rivalry, but illuminated by wonder. The space race, though born of rivalry and sharpened by fear, became one of the most profound catalysts for scientific, technological, and cultural transformation in modern history. As the 1960s unfolded, the broader implications of this celestial competition began to ripple through every layer of society, reshaping not only how nations viewed each other, but how humanity viewed itself. In the United States, the drive to surpass the Soviet Union in space led to an unprecedented investment in research and development. Federal funding poured into universities, laboratories, and private industry, fueling innovations that extended far beyond rocketry. The technologies developed for space exploration, miniaturized electronics, advanced materials, computer systems, and telecommunications, began to find applications in everyday life. From medical imaging to weather forecasting, from satellite television to global positioning systems, the legacy of the space race became embedded in the fabric of modern civilization. The Cold War had inadvertently accelerated the future. Education, too, underwent a transformation. The National Defense Education Act had laid the groundwork, but the momentum continued to build. Science fairs, math competitions, and space-themed curricula became common across American schools. A generation of students grew up idolizing astronauts and engineers, dreaming not just of fame or fortune, but of discovery. The idea that knowledge could be a form of patriotism took root, and with it, a cultural shift toward valuing intellectual achievement. In the Soviet Union, the impact was equally profound. The success of Sputnik and subsequent missions bolstered national pride and reinforced the narrative of Soviet scientific superiority. The government invested heavily in its own educational and research institutions, cultivating a cadre of scientists and engineers who would continue to push the boundaries of space exploration. Yet the centralized nature of the Soviet system also imposed limits. Information was tightly controlled, and failures were often hidden from public view. This secrecy, while intended to protect national prestige, sometimes hindered collaboration and innovation. Still, the achievements were remarkable. The Soviet space program pioneered many firsts: the first satellite, the first animal in orbit, the first human in space, the first woman in space, and the first spacewalk. These milestones were not just technical feats, they were symbols of possibility, proof that humanity could transcend its earthly limitations. As both nations raced toward the moon, the geopolitical stakes remained high. Space had become a theater of soft power, where prestige and influence were measured in orbits and landings. But it was also a realm where the rules were still being written. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and other nations, established important principles: that space would be used for peaceful purposes, that celestial bodies could not be claimed by any one nation, and that astronauts would be regarded as envoys of humanity. This treaty, born in the shadow of Cold War rivalry, represented a rare moment of consensus, a recognition that space, though contested, belonged to all. The military implications of space exploration, however, could not be ignored. Both superpowers developed reconnaissance satellites capable of monitoring troop movements, missile installations, and nuclear tests. These eyes in the sky became essential tools of deterrence and diplomacy, providing critical intelligence that helped prevent misunderstandings and manage crises. The concept of mutually assured destruction, grim as it was, relied in part on the ability to verify the other side's capabilities. Space, in this context, became a stabilizing force. Yet the line between peaceful exploration and military application remained thin. Anti-satellite weapons were tested, and both nations explored the potential for space-based missile defense systems. The dream of space as a sanctuary from conflict was constantly challenged by the realities of geopolitics. Still, amid the tension, there were moments of cooperation. Scientists from both sides occasionally shared data, and cultural exchanges began to bridge the divide. The idea of joint missions, once unthinkable, began to take shape in the minds of visionaries. The seeds of future collaboration were being planted, even as the race continued. The cultural impact of the space race was equally significant. It inspired art, literature, music, and film. From the pages of science fiction novels to the frames of cinematic epics, space became a canvas for exploring human hopes and fears. The image of Earth from orbit, a fragile blue sphere suspended in darkness, profoundly altered humanity's self-perception. It reminded us of our shared home, our common destiny. The Cold War had driven us to the stars, but the stars, in turn, had shown us the unity of our world. As the decade drew to a close, the culmination of these efforts approached. The Apollo program, with its bold promise of a lunar landing, stood as a testament to what could be achieved when ambition, resources, and purpose aligned. The space race had begun with a beeping satellite and a burst of fear, but it had grown into something far greater, a journey of discovery, a testament to resilience, and a mirror reflecting both the divisions and the dreams of humanity. The Cold War continued, but space had changed the game. It had opened a new chapter in the human story, one written not in the language of conquest, but in the quiet, persistent pursuit of knowledge. And though the rivalry remained, so too did the wonder. As we reach the final stretch of this journey, take a moment to breathe deeply and let your thoughts drift gently through the vastness of time and space. The Cold War, with all its tension and turmoil, gave rise to something extraordinary, a race not just for dominance, but for discovery. From the launch of Sputnik to the footsteps on the moon, humanity had crossed a threshold. The Apollo 11 mission, launched on the 16th of July, 1969, and culminating in Neil Armstrong's historic step onto the lunar surface on the 20th of July, was the crowning achievement of the space race. Millions watched as grainy images flickered across television screens, capturing a moment that transcended borders and ideologies. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," Armstrong declared, and in that instant, the world held its breath. The moon landing was not just an American victory, it was a human triumph. It proved that with vision, cooperation, and determination, we could overcome the impossible. The Cold War had driven the mission, but the result belonged to everyone. The image of Earth rising over the lunar horizon, captured by Apollo 8, became an icon of unity and fragility. It reminded us that in the vastness of space, we are all passengers on the same small, blue planet. In the years that followed, the intensity of the space race began to wane. The Soviet Union continued its lunar efforts but never achieved a manned landing. Instead, both nations shifted focus toward long-term exploration and cooperation. The 1975 Apollo-Soyuz test project marked a symbolic end to the era of fierce competition. American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit, and astronauts from both sides shook hands in microgravity. It was a gesture of peace, a promise of what space could become, a place not of rivalry, but of partnership. The legacy of the space race lives on in countless ways. It laid the foundation for the International Space Station, where astronauts from around the world live and work together. It inspired generations of scientists, engineers, and dreamers. It gave us technologies that touch every aspect of modern life. And perhaps most importantly, it expanded our sense of what is possible. The Cold War may have sparked the race, but the stars became a shared destination. Today, as new nations and private companies reach for the heavens, the spirit of exploration continues. Mars rovers roam distant landscapes, telescopes peer into the birth of galaxies, and spacecraft sail beyond the edge of our solar system. The journey that began with a beeping satellite has become a voyage without end. So now, as you rest in the quiet after this long and wondrous tale, let your thoughts drift among the stars. Remember the courage it took to look up and say, "We can go there." Remember the brilliance that turned dreams into rockets, and rockets into history. And remember that even in times of division, we are capable of reaching together towards something greater. If you've enjoyed this journey through time and space, I invite you to relax, subscribe, and return whenever you wish to explore more stories that soothe the mind and stir the imagination. Until then, may your nights be peaceful, your dreams expansive, and your spirit ever curious.